In today's lesson, we're going to take a look at how we can add bebop saxophone lines to our blues playing to give us some new colors and some great new phrasing ideas. I'm going to cover 3 licks by 3 of my favorite players, and at the end of the video, we'll tie it all together into a solo. My name is Jack Ruch. Welcome to my channel. Let's get into it. This first line comes from the great Cannonball Adderley off of his 1959 record, Live in San Francisco. This is one of my all-time favorite records and definitely worth checking out. But this lick comes from the tune Spontaneous Combustion, which is an up-tempo blues in the key of B flat. But for all of today's examples, we're going to be playing in the key of C. Now, this lick happens at the top of the form, so from the 1 chord transitioning to the 4 chord, and he uses some really nice altered notes over that 1 chord to transition to the 4 chord. So I'll play it down one time and then we'll break it down. All right, so like I said before, this first lick falls right at the top of the form, right? So going from C7 or C9 to an F7 or F9 chord, right? The 1 chord to the 4 chord. And this lick really leans heavily on that 9th, the note D, right, over that C chord. And he does sort of this enclosure where he's playing, right? He's playing the 9th and then coming down to the root and then the major 7th, which is sort of, right, encircling that root note. And he's really not afraid to use that major 7th, even though this is a blues. Kind of using it in a chromatic way like that is a really common thing you hear in a lot of bebop phrasing. So it starts out, right? And then he sort of continues that theme. Right, a lot of the same notes in there. He's sliding up to the 3rd and the 5th, right, highlighting chord tones out of that chord and then coming back to that 9th. So I'll play that first part really slow. Right, and then the next part. Right, so he leaves that nice pause in there to give a little space between those 2 lines. Now, the really interesting part of this lick comes in the next little section where it transitions to the 4 chord, and he's using some altered notes over this C7 chord, right? Things like the flat 13 and the flat 9, and he plays, right, and a nice little kind of downward chromatic movement to eventually land on the 3rd of that F chord, right? So that part starts on that flat 13 and then does a little sort of half-step little hammer-on pull-off trill. And then down to the 3rd and then right down here to the flat 9, right? So this D flat, right? Which is, again, a note that, you know, if you're playing C blues, you're not necessarily going to think to play a half step up from the root, right? It can kind of seem like a wrong note. But in this sense, when you're using it in a line to transition to the 4 chord, right, it can be a really nice, colorful note to add some tension to that C chord as it resolves to the F. So, and right there in the middle of that chromatic line, he kind of comes down to that 5th. Right, and that's a really common kind of bebop thing to sort of bounce around between intervals and kind of hit those lower notes. So I'll play the whole thing really slow. And again, if you want to really get into this, you know, and see it on paper, I've got all the tabs for these licks. I'm going to have them all available on my Patreon page. So here it is really slow. Right, so right there as we end, we've transitioned really nice to the 4 chord. So that's the first lick from Spontaneous Combustion off the Live in San Francisco album by the great Cannonball Adderley. So this next lick comes from Charlie Parker, one of the founding fathers of bebop, and this is from his classic recording of Billy's Bounce. Now this lick falls over the 4 chord, and he uses some great blues vocabulary along with some really nice chromaticism to transition to the next chords in the progression. So I'll play it down one time and then we'll break it down. Check it out. All right, so this next lick happens over the 4 chord. And like I said before, this is a great Cannonball Adderley line from a really classic jazz blues recording, the song Billy's Bounce. If you haven't checked that out, it's really a great starting place if you're trying to get into this style. So many great lines and such a hugely inspirational and influential recording. So this lick starts over this 4 chord, so sort of where that last lick left off. And he plays like some really nice, just kind of bluesy phrasing. Right? That transitions really nice from the 4 chord back to the 1 chord, and then eventually down to the 6 chord, right? Because that's sort of the next part of the progression, right? We're going to go 6, 2, 5, and then back to 1, right? This is sort of the trademark of a jazz blues, right? Is having that 6, 2, 5, 1 in there instead of just going to the 5 chord and the 4 chord in sort of more of a traditional blues, you know, 3 chord form. All right, this is a big part of what gives this kind of bebop jazz blues its flavor. So this lick starts out by just hitting the root up on the high E string, and then he comes down this flat 5th, which is a great kind of bluesy note. Right, so, and then again, sort of bouncing from a lower note to a higher note. Right, that's really kind of a trademark thing of the way a lot of these horn players phrase lines. So, right, and so all that is sort of, you know, right out of this C dominant scale, right? There's the 9th, down to the root, flat 7, and major 6, right? So he's kind of starting out with like a little minor-y blues thing, and then right down that dominant scale. And then, you know, the 4 to the 9 to the 2, and then here he starts this really nice little chromatic run, which transitions to the root of this 6 chord. So that starts on the flat 3, 3, 4, flat 5. So up to the perfect 5th, right? So, and does this little hammer-on pull-off trill. And then as it transitions to that chord, he's hitting the 9 and root of that 6 chord. So a really beautiful sort of flowing way of transitioning through those chords with some bluesy stuff at the front, a nice little chromatic run, and then targeting the chord tones. And this really comes down to anticipating the chord changes and hearing where the chord progression is going before you get there, so you can play into it and really play through the changes instead of reacting to the changes. And this is something that a lot of these great sax players were masters at doing. So there's the whole line. Now I'll play it slowed way down. Right, so a great lick, and again, all the tabs are going to be up on my Patreon page if that's an easier way for you to learn these things. You can also always hit the playback speed in the settings if you want to slow this stuff down further. That's a great way that I use to learn this stuff too. All right, let's move on to the third line. This final line comes from Jimmy Forrest. This is off a great record called Black Forest. And this line comes from the title track of that album. And it's a really up-tempo swing blues, but we're going to slow this line down a little bit to fit over this groove we've been playing over today. Now, this lick fits over the 6-2-5-1 portion of a jazz blues progression. And he uses some really nice phrasing and interesting note choices to create a great line over this section of the progression. So again, I'll play it down and then we'll break it down. All right, so this last lick falls over the 6-2-5-1 portion of the progression. And again, that's sort of signature of this jazz blues style, right, is to have that kind of turnaround section in there. And this lick starts out, right, by really targeting chord tones of the 6th chord. We're coming from C and we're heading down to A7. And we play this little kind of hammer-on, pull-off slide, right, which is really, you know, characteristic of the kind of phrasing you hear with sax players. And then we're right down here targeting the 3rd, and I'm visualizing on the guitar this chord shape as I see that, you know. And again, you know, we're playing chord tones. We come from the 3rd down to the 5th to the flat 7th, and then here again is that flat 9, right, a half step up from the root of this A7, because the chord we're heading to is D, and this A7, the 6th chord, is a secondary dominant chord, right? A7 is acting as the 5 chord of D, right? It's a functioning dominant chord. So just like we can do the 1 chord going to the 4 chord, we can use those altered colored notes to add some tension. We can do the same thing going from A7 to D. I mean, the chord movement is the same. You know, C7 moving to F is the same relationship as A7 moving to D. So all that kind of stuff, that flat 13, you know, sharp 9, flat 9 kind of stuff, works equally well in that spot. So, right, so there's that flat 9. And then, let's see, he transitions to this 2 chord. Right, and he falls right down to the major 3rd of that D chord, which in a blues, you'll find this D chord will either be sometimes a minor, like a 2 minor, or it can be a 2 dominant as well. So, then from here, he plays a really interesting choice of notes. He basically uses like an A minor triad over this section of the progression, which, you know, if you looked at this as a D7 chord, that would be the 5th, the flat 7th, and the 9th. But you can also look at it as, you know, an A minor kind of interval jumping, sort of bouncing thing with some chromatic notes. So from the third down here, and then as it comes back, you know, that's sort of over this 5 chord, right? So we're on the 6 chord, 2, and then the 5. There's the flat 7 down to the 5th interval of this chord. Again, I'm visualizing this chord and I'm seeing there's the flat 7, there's the 5th, right in that chord shape, with these nice little chromatic colors to kind of get there. And then he plays a really nice C major 7 arpeggio and lands on the 5th. So again, not afraid to use the major 7th, even in a blues context. Is something you hear a lot with these bebop guys. They'll kind of reharmonize the chords and play lines, you know, that sound really beautiful and melodic without sticking too much to sort of traditional blues ideas. But this whole line tied together is really a great, you know, beautiful set of phrases that work over these changes. So I'll play it one more time and then I'll play it really slow. And here it is slowed way down. So now that we've covered these 3 different lines, we can tie them all together to create a really nice solo. And this is a great way to add new vocabulary to your playing. Transcribe different players and then pull the solos apart and combine them with other things that you know to create new ways of navigating through the chord changes. So I'm going to take these 3 lines that we've covered and I'm going to play them over the different portions of the progression and tie them together and try to seamlessly transition from one to the next. And you can see how I can create a really nice little 12-bar chorus solo through this progression. So check it out. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to head over to my Patreon page if you want to get all the tabs for this lesson, all these licks and solos that I played, plus the backing track that I played over. That's a great place to go to get all the supplemental content that comes along with this YouTube channel. And don't forget to just subscribe and check the links down in the description for all my different courses. As always, I want to thank you guys for joining me here on the channel and all your support. I will catch you next time. Happy practicing.